The evening shift at Memorial Hospital usually followed a predictable pattern, but on that warm summer night in June, everything changed. The emergency room was relatively quiet, with only the usual mix of patients dealing with minor injuries and seasonal allergies. Nurse Thompson, who had been working at the hospital for over 15 years, was updating patient charts at the nurses' station when she heard the automatic doors slide open. Looking up, she saw a sight that made her do a double take. A young black girl, probably no more than 12 years old, was rushing through the entrance. What caught everyone's attention was the small bundle she carried close to her chest. The girl's dark braids were falling loose around her face, and she was breathing heavily as if she'd been running. "Please, please help," the girl called out, her voice trembling but determined. "I found a baby. The baby needs help." The medical staff froze for a moment, trying to process what they were seeing. As the girl came closer, they could see she was cradling a newborn infant, a white baby, still covered in birth residue, wrapped in what appeared to be the girl's own jacket. The contrast between the young rescuer and the infant she carried created a scene that caused several staff members to exchange confused glances. Nurse Thompson was the first to snap into action. Years of experience had taught her that questions could wait, medical care came first. She quickly guided the girl to the nearest examination room, calling for Dr. Chen, the pediatrician on duty. The hospital staff moved with practiced efficiency, but their sideways glances and whispered conversations revealed their struggle to make sense of the situation. The young girl refused to let go of the baby until Nurse Thompson gently assured her that they needed to check the infant's vital signs. Even then, she hovered nearby, her eyes never leaving the tiny bundle. The baby was unusually quiet, which concerned the medical team, and its skin felt cool to the touch, not a good sign for a newborn. The emergency room began buzzing with activity. Some staff members were preparing warming blankets and specialized equipment for newborn care, while others were trying to contact hospital administration and social services. A security guard stationed himself near the door, uncertain whether this was a case requiring police involvement. Throughout the commotion, Nurse Thompson noticed something remarkable about the young girl. Despite the chaos around her, despite her obvious exhaustion, and despite being clearly overwhelmed by the situation, she maintained a protective stance near the baby. Her eyes followed every movement of the medical staff, and she answered their initial questions with a maturity that seemed beyond her years. The other patients in the waiting room had begun to notice the unusual scene unfolding. Some craned their necks to get a better view, while others whispered among themselves, creating their own theories about what might have happened. The girl seemed oblivious to their attention, focused entirely on making sure the baby was receiving care. As Dr. Chen examined the infant, Nurse Thompson brought the girl a cup of water and pulled up a chair for her. The girl's hands were shaking slightly as she took the cup, and that's when Thompson noticed the scrapes on her knees, evidence of her hurried journey to the hospital. Her school backpack was still slung over one shoulder, and her uniform suggested she had probably been on her way home when whatever happened happened. The initial confusion in the emergency room gradually gave way to professional focus, but questions lingered in everyone's minds. Who was this brave young girl? Where had she found the baby? And what circumstances had led to this extraordinary situation? As Nurse Thompson watched the girl finally sink into the chair, exhausted but unwilling to leave, she knew this was just the beginning of a remarkable story. The clock on the wall read 6:45 p.m., and the summer sun was still streaming through the emergency room windows, casting long shadows across the floor. None of the hospital staff could have predicted how this evening would unfold, or how this young girl's actions would challenge their preconceptions and touch their hearts in unexpected ways. The medical team worked diligently around the baby, hooking up monitors and checking vital signs, while the girl watched with worried eyes. It was clear to everyone present that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a story of courage and compassion that would soon capture the attention of the entire community and beyond. As the medical team worked to stabilize the baby, they began learning more about the young hero who had brought the infant to safety. The girl, who introduced herself as Annie, sat in the emergency room chair, her school uniform slightly disheveled from her run to the hospital. Despite her evident exhaustion, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that impressed everyone around her. Nurse Thompson noticed how Annie's eyes never left the baby, even as she began sharing her story. Her voice was soft but clear, and she spoke with a maturity that seemed to belong to someone much older than her 12 years. The hospital staff, who had initially been thrown off balance by the unusual situation, found themselves drawn to Annie's calm presence. "I couldn't just leave the baby there," she explained, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I heard crying, and something inside me just knew I had to help." The sincerity in her voice touched everyone within earshot, including other patients who had forgotten their own discomforts to listen to the unfolding story. Dr. Chen, who had been examining the infant, paused his work to ask Annie some questions about where she had found the baby. The young girl's answers were precise and thoughtful, showing remarkable attention to detail. She remembered the exact location, the time, and even small details about the scene that would later prove crucial to the investigation. The social worker who arrived, Mrs. Parker, was immediately struck by Annie's composure. While most children her age might have been overwhelmed by the situation and the attention, Annie remained focused on what mattered most, the baby's well-being. She answered questions clearly and honestly, her dark eyes serious as she recounted the events of the evening. As the story emerged, the hospital staff learned that Annie was a straight-A student who lived with her grandmother just a few blocks from the hospital. She was active in her school's community service club and helped care for younger children at her local community center. This background seemed to explain her instinctive response to help a baby in distress. Annie's grandmother arrived at the hospital about an hour later, rushing through the emergency room doors with worry etched on her face. The moment she saw her granddaughter, she wrapped her in a tight embrace, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You did the right thing, baby," she whispered, holding Annie close. "You did exactly the right thing." The grandmother's arrival seemed to finally allow Annie to relax slightly. She leaned into her grandmother's embrace, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital, her shoulders dropped from their tense position. The staff could see that beneath her remarkable composure, she was still very much a young girl who had been through an extraordinary experience. Throughout the evening, various hospital staff members found reasons to pass by Annie's chair, each one touched by her story and wanting to offer a kind word or a smile. Some brought her snacks from the break room, while others made sure she and her grandmother had everything they needed. The security guard who had initially been suspicious now stood protectively near them, ensuring they weren't overwhelmed by curious onlookers. As night fell, the baby's condition stabilized, thanks in large part to Annie's quick thinking and swift action. The infant's body temperature had returned to normal, and the doctors were optimistic about a full recovery. Each time they shared positive updates about the baby's condition, Annie's face would light up with relief. The police officers who came to take Annie's statement were struck by her detailed account and her obvious concern for the baby's welfare. She wasn't interested in being called a hero, she simply wanted to make sure the infant was safe and would be well cared for. Her genuine compassion touched even these seasoned officers who had seen their fair share of difficult situations. As the night progressed, news began to spread through the hospital about the young girl who had saved an abandoned baby. Staff members from other departments found excuses to pass through the emergency room, each one leaving with a renewed faith in humanity after witnessing Annie's quiet strength and compassion. What stood out most to everyone who interacted with Annie was her complete lack of prejudice or judgment. She hadn't seen color when she found the baby, she had simply seen a tiny human being in need of help. Her actions and attitude served as a powerful reminder to all the adults around her about the pure, uncomplicated nature of true compassion. By the time Annie and her grandmother prepared to leave the hospital, she had touched countless hearts and challenged numerous assumptions. The emergency room staff, who had initially been baffled by the sight of a young black girl carrying a white infant, now saw only the beauty of human kindness, transcending all boundaries. Before leaving, Annie made the hospital staff promise to keep her updated about the baby's progress. As she walked out of the emergency room, holding her grandmother's hand, she left behind a profound impact on everyone who had witnessed her remarkable display of courage and compassion. The hospital staff knew they would remember this night for years to come, not just for its unusual circumstances, but for the powerful lesson in humanity taught by a 12-year-old girl. As Annie sat in the hospital room with her grandmother by her side, she began sharing the full story of how she discovered the baby. The room fell silent as hospital staff, police officers, and social workers gathered to hear her account of that life-changing moment. It had been a typical after-school day. Annie had stopped at the corner store to buy some notebook paper for her homework. The sun was still bright in the sky, and she was taking her usual route home when something made her pause. At first, she thought she was hearing things, a faint sound that could have been a cat or maybe the wind. But something about it made her stop and listen more carefully. "I heard this tiny cry," Annie explained, her voice soft but clear. "It was so quiet that if a car had passed by at that moment, I might have missed it completely." She described how she stood still, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. The crying seemed to be coming from behind the old brick building near the parking lot. Following the sound, Annie had walked carefully toward the dumpster area behind the building. Her heart was beating fast, not from fear, but from a growing sense that something wasn't right. As she got closer, the crying became more distinct. It was definitely not a cat. It was the unmistakable sound of a baby. "When I looked behind the dumpster," Annie continued, her eyes growing wide at the memory, "I saw this bundle of fabric. It was just lying there on the ground." Her voice trembled slightly as she recalled the moment. "At first, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The bundle moved slightly, and that's when I knew for sure there was a baby wrapped in those blankets." The hospital staff listened intently as Annie described how she had carefully approached the bundle. The baby was wrapped in what looked like an old t-shirt and a thin blanket placed on a flattened cardboard box. The infant was still covered in birthing fluid, the umbilical cord had been roughly cut, and the baby's skin felt cold to her touch. "I knew the baby needed help right away," Annie explained. "The poor thing was so cold, and the crying was getting weaker." Without hesitation, she had taken off her school jacket and gently wrapped it around the baby, making sure to support the tiny head, just as she'd learned from helping with her younger cousins at family gatherings. Her instincts had told her that there was no time to waste looking for help or trying to call someone. The hospital was 6 blocks away, and she knew that would be faster than waiting for an ambulance. Holding the baby close to her chest to share her body warmth, she had started running. "I didn't even think about how it looked," Annie said, glancing at her grandmother who squeezed her hand supportively. "I just knew this baby needed help, and I had to get to the hospital as fast as I could." She described how she ran all 6 blocks, barely stopping to catch her breath, talking softly to the baby the whole time to let it know everything would be okay. The social worker asked Annie if she had seen anyone else in the area or noticed anything suspicious. Annie shook her head, explaining that the area behind the building had been completely deserted. "It was like someone knew that spot was usually empty," she said thoughtfully. "But I just can't understand how anyone could leave a baby like that." The police officers took careful notes as Annie described the exact location and the condition of the area where she found the baby. Her detailed observations would prove invaluable to their investigation. She remembered everything. From the color of the t-shirt, the baby was wrapped into the position of the cardboard box behind the dumpster. Throughout her retelling, Annie's concern remained focused on the baby's welfare. She kept glancing toward the nursery where the infant was now being cared for, and her face would light up whenever a nurse brought updates about the baby's improving condition. The medical staff were amazed by how Annie's quick thinking and immediate action had likely saved the baby's life. The doctor explained that if the infant had been left in the cold for much longer, the outcome could have been tragic. Annie's discovery of the baby and her immediate response had made all the difference. As the evening wore on, Annie's story began spreading throughout the hospital. Staff members who heard it were touched not only by her bravery, but by the pure humanity of her response. She hadn't hesitated or questioned what to do. She had simply acted with compassion and determination. The revelation of how Annie found the baby sparked various emotions among those who heard it. There was anger at whoever had abandoned the infant in such a dangerous way, but more prominently, there was admiration for the young girl who had followed her instincts and taken action when it mattered most. Annie's grandmother held her close as she finished telling her story, proud tears streaming down her face. "That's my girl," she said softly. "You've always had a big heart, always thinking of others." The hospital staff nodded in agreement, moved by the bond between grandmother and granddaughter and by the extraordinary events that had brought them all together that evening. The story of how Annie found the baby would soon spread beyond the hospital walls, touching hearts and challenging assumptions throughout the community. But for now, in that hospital room, it remained a powerful reminder of how one person's compassion and courage could make the difference between life and death. The quick thinking and determined actions that Annie took in those crucial moments became the focus of everyone's attention. As medical professionals reviewed the sequence of events, they realized just how remarkable her response had been. Every decision she made, from the moment she heard that faint cry to her arrival at the hospital, showed wisdom beyond her years. The head pediatrician gathered the emergency room staff to discuss the baby's condition. The infant's body temperature was dangerously low when brought in, he explained to the team. If Annie hadn't acted so quickly, hadn't wrapped the baby in her jacket, hadn't run those 6 blocks. His voice trailed off, but everyone understood the unspoken implications. Those precious minutes had made all the difference. Annie's grandmother sat listening to the medical staff, occasionally wiping tears from her eyes. She's always been special, she told the nurses. Even as a tiny thing, she would notice when other kids were upset at the playground. She'd share her snacks, give up her swing, just naturally caring. The grandmother shared how she'd raised Annie since she was a toddler, teaching her values of kindness and responsibility. The hospital staff were particularly impressed by Annie's clear thinking during the emergency. She hadn't wasted time looking for her phone to call for help. She hadn't panicked or frozen when faced with such an overwhelming situation. Instead, she had assessed the situation and taken the most direct action possible, getting the baby to professional care as quickly as she could. I remembered from science class how babies need to stay warm, Annie explained when asked about her decision to use her jacket. And I knew from helping with my little cousins that you have to support a baby's head. These simple but crucial pieces of knowledge, combined with her quick thinking, had potentially saved the infant's life. The security cameras later revealed the full extent of Annie's effort. The footage showed her running at full speed through the streets, carefully cradling the bundle against her chest. She had dodged around pedestrians, waited for cars at crossings, all while keeping the baby secure. Despite her obvious urgency, she had maintained enough presence of mind to keep the infant safe during the journey. A nurse who reviewed Annie's initial arrival at the emergency room noted how she had immediately called out for help, but stayed calm enough to explain the situation clearly. Most adults panic in crisis situations, the nurse commented, but she kept her head. She made sure we understood what was happening and what the baby needed. The pediatric team confirmed that Annie's quick response had prevented several potential complications. The baby had been suffering from hypothermia when found, but the combination of Annie's body heat through her jacket and the speed with which she got the infant to medical care had prevented any lasting damage. The doctors explained that newborns can't regulate their body temperature well, making the first hours after birth critically important. Annie's physical education teacher, who visited the hospital after hearing the news, wasn't surprised by her students' stamina during the emergency. She never gives up in class, the teacher shared. When we do running exercises, she always pushes through, even when it's tough. That determination probably helped her today. The police officers investigating the case were equally impressed by Annie's level-headed actions. She had managed to note important details about the scene while still focusing on the baby's immediate needs. Her clear description of the location and surrounding area would prove invaluable to their investigation. As word spread about Annie's actions, local news reporters began gathering outside the hospital. Her grandmother firmly protected her from the growing media attention, insisting that Annie needed rest and time to process the events. The hospital staff supported this decision, creating a quiet space where Annie could decompress from the intensity of the situation. Throughout the evening, Annie continued to show the same level-headed approach that had characterized her emergency response. She answered questions clearly, helped with the investigation, but always brought the focus back to the baby's well-being. When asked about being called a hero, she simply shrugged and said, "I just did what needed to be done." The impact of Annie's quick thinking extended beyond just saving the baby's life. Her actions served as an inspiration to others, showing how clear thinking and decisive action in a crisis can make a crucial difference. The emergency room staff began discussing using her story as an example in their community outreach programs, teaching others about the importance of acting quickly but carefully in emergency situations. As the night drew to a close, the full significance of Annie's quick thinking became clear to everyone involved. Her series of smart decisions, from recognizing the cry as a baby's, to running to the hospital instead of waiting for an ambulance, to maintaining the infant's warmth, had created a chain of events that led to the best possible outcome in a potentially tragic situation. The baby, now stable and receiving expert care in the hospital's neonatal unit, was living proof of how one person's quick thinking and brave actions could change the course of a life. Annie's story would go on to inspire many, but in those first crucial hours, it was her clear head and quick decisions that had made all the difference. As dawn broke the next morning, the investigation into the baby's abandonment began in earnest. 2 police detectives arrived at the hospital early, armed with surveillance footage they had gathered from the surrounding area. The cameras had captured more than just Annie's heroic run. They revealed crucial details about the hours before the baby was found. The footage showed a figure in a dark hoodie moving furtively behind the building shortly before Annie discovered the infant. The detectives worked carefully, piecing together a timeline from various security cameras in the neighborhood. They were particularly impressed with how Annie's detailed observations matched perfectly with what they saw in the footage. Back at the hospital, social services had become deeply involved in the case. The baby was responding well to treatment, gaining strength with each passing hour. The social worker assigned to the case worked tirelessly, checking databases of recent births and missing persons reports, trying to understand how a newborn could end up abandoned behind a dumpster. Annie's grandmother had brought her back to the hospital that morning, knowing her granddaughter was worried about the baby. The young girl's face lit up when she saw the infant, now pink and healthy-looking in the nursery incubator. The nurses noticed how the baby seemed to respond to Annie's voice, turning slightly whenever she spoke nearby. The police investigation revealed more details as the day progressed. Security footage from a nearby convenience store showed a young woman who appeared to be in distress entering the store's bathroom earlier that day. The store owner remembered her buying a few basic supplies, but hadn't realized she was in labor. The community began rallying around the story. Local news covered the investigation sensitively, focusing on the importance of safe haven laws and support for mothers in crisis. That highlighted how every state has laws allowing newborns to be safely surrendered at hospitals, fire stations, or police stations, no questions asked. The hospital staff who had witnessed Annie's arrival with the baby provided detailed statements to the investigators. Their testimonies painted a vivid picture of how close the timing had been. The pediatrician explained that another hour in the cold could have led to severe complications for the newborn. Annie's school principal visited the hospital, bringing cards made by her classmates. The principal shared how Annie's actions had sparked important discussions among the students about civic responsibility and helping others in need. The school was planning to incorporate the incident into their health and safety curriculum, teaching students about safe haven laws and appropriate responses to emergencies. The investigation took an unexpected turn when a young nursing student came forward with information. She had been on her break at a nearby cafe when she noticed someone who matched the description from the security footage. The police followed this lead carefully, understanding the sensitivity of the situation. Throughout the investigation, Annie remained a crucial witness. Her clear recollections helped the police narrow down their search area and timeline. The detectives were impressed by her mature understanding of the situation and her compassion, even for the person who had abandoned the baby. Local community organizations began reaching out, wanting to help both the baby and highlight the broader issues the case had brought to light. A women's shelter director spoke about the importance of supporting mothers in crisis, while a child welfare advocate discussed the vital role of safe haven laws. The hospital's security team compiled all their footage, showing Annie's arrival from multiple angles. The recordings revealed details that hadn't been immediately apparent: how she had carefully shielded the baby from the automatic door's air blast, how she had instinctively moved toward the warmest part of the emergency room. As the investigation progressed, social services worked to ensure the baby's immediate future was secure. They began the process of finding a temporary foster placement, knowing that legal proceedings would take time to resolve. Annie asked if she could visit the baby in its new home, showing the same protective instinct that had driven her to act in the first place. The police worked methodically, following leads and interviewing witnesses. They treated the case with sensitivity, understanding that fear and desperation often drive such abandonments. Their goal was not just to solve the case, but to prevent similar incidents by raising awareness of alternatives. The investigation had broader impacts on the community. Local health organizations began new outreach programs, ensuring that information about safe haven laws and crisis support was widely available. Annie's story became a catalyst for positive change, prompting discussions about how communities can better support people in desperate situations. As the fifth day of the investigation drew to a close, the pieces were starting to come together. The baby was thriving, Annie was being celebrated as a community hero, and important conversations about preventing similar incidents were taking place throughout the city. The case had become more than just a police investigation. It was a wake-up call about the importance of community support and awareness. As Annie's story spread throughout the community, it began to touch hearts and change minds in unexpected ways. The local newspaper ran a front-page article about her actions, focusing not just on the rescue itself, but on the lessons it taught about looking past appearances and acting with pure compassion. In the days following the incident, the hospital received countless calls and letters from people moved by the story. Many shared how it had challenged their own preconceptions and biases. A retired teacher wrote about using Annie's story to teach her grandchildren about judging character rather than color. A business owner admitted that the story had made him reconsider some of his own unconscious biases. The impact rippled through the city's schools as well. Teachers reported students having deep, meaningful discussions about race, compassion, and doing the right thing. Annie's school held an assembly about heroism in everyday life, where students shared their own experiences of facing and overcoming prejudice. Annie's grandmother was invited to speak at community gatherings, where she shared stories of raising her granddaughter to see beyond surface differences. "We taught her that character matters more than color," she would say, her voice full of pride. But she taught us all how naturally children can embrace that truth. The hospital staff who had witnessed Annie's arrival organized a small ceremony to honor her actions. Instead of focusing on the dramatic aspects of the rescue, they emphasized how her quick thinking and lack of prejudice had saved a life. The pediatrician spoke about how Annie's actions reminded them all to check their own biases at the door. Local community leaders began using the incident as a starting point for broader discussions about unity and understanding. Town hall meetings were organized where people could share their experiences and ideas for building stronger community bonds. Annie's story became a catalyst for conversations that many felt were long overdue. Religious leaders from various faiths spoke about the universal values demonstrated in Annie's actions. They pointed out how a child had shown the way forward, acting with pure compassion, unmarred by the prejudices that often cloud adult perspectives. Their sermons and talks emphasized how true humanity transcends all surface differences. The media coverage evolved from simply reporting the incident to exploring its deeper implications. Thoughtful editorials appeared discussing how Annie's actions challenged common stereotypes and assumptions. Television reports featured interviews with people whose perspectives had been changed by the story. A local artist created a mural depicting the scene, showing a young girl running with a bundle in her arms, surrounded by words like compassion, courage, and unity. The mural became a gathering point for community events and discussions about breaking down barriers between people. Annie herself remained humble throughout the attention, often redirecting conversations back to the importance of helping others in need. When interviewed, she would simply say, "I just saw someone who needed help. That's all that mattered to me." The incident sparked practical changes as well. Several local organizations launched initiatives to promote understanding across racial and cultural lines. Youth programs were created to foster the kind of natural acceptance that Annie had displayed. Community centers began hosting regular events aimed at bringing different groups together. The hospital used the story in their diversity training programs, highlighting how unconscious bias can affect even medical professionals. They incorporated Annie's arrival at the emergency room as a case study in their staff development sessions, promoting discussions about maintaining objectivity in high-stress situations. Schools across the city began incorporating similar lessons into their curricula. Teachers developed activities that helped students explore their own biases and learn to look beyond surface differences. Annie's story became a powerful teaching tool for promoting empathy and understanding. Local businesses joined the movement, with some launching scholarship programs for students who demonstrated exceptional community service and bridge building between different groups. Others sponsored community events aimed at promoting unity and understanding. As weeks passed, the impact of Annie's actions continued to grow. What had started as a dramatic rescue became a symbol of hope and a call to action. People began to understand that the true power of her story lay not just in the saving of a life, but in the lesson it taught about seeing past differences to recognize our common humanity. The community's response showed how one person's pure and unbiased actions could spark meaningful change. Annie's story didn't just challenge prejudices, it showed a way forward, demonstrating how natural and simple it can be to help others without regard for superficial differences. The aftermath of Annie's heroic actions continued to unfold in beautiful and unexpected ways. The baby, now healthy and thriving, found a permanent home with a loving family who had been waiting to adopt. They chose to name her Hope, inspired by the circumstances of her rescue and the hope she represented for positive change in the community. Annie maintained a special connection with baby Hope and her adoptive family. The parents recognized the unique bond between the girl who saved their daughter's life and the infant who had brought them all together. They invited Annie to be a part of Hope's life, and she became like a big sister to the child she had rescued. During Hope's first birthday celebration, Annie sat beside the high chair, helping the baby reach for her cake. The room was filled with both families, Annie's grandmother, Hope's adoptive parents, and many of the hospital staff who had been there on that fateful night. Looking around the room, it was impossible to see anything but love and joy. The story's impact extended far beyond that birthday party. Local schools developed a tradition of celebrating Community Hero Day on the anniversary of Annie's rescue. Students would share stories of everyday heroes in their lives and discuss ways they could help others without prejudice or hesitation. Annie's grandmother watched with pride as her granddaughter grew into a confident young teenager. The experience had shaped Annie's future aspirations. She began volunteering at the hospital's pediatric ward and talked about becoming a doctor someday. Her natural compassion, combined with her experience, made her a comforting presence for worried parents and scared children. The police eventually located Hope's birth mother, a young woman who had been in desperate circumstances. Rather than pursuing punishment, the community rallied to provide support and resources. Annie's actions had sparked a broader conversation about supporting mothers in crisis and preventing similar situations through community outreach. Hope's adoptive parents started a foundation focused on promoting safe haven laws and supporting families in crisis. They named it Annie's Hope Foundation, despite Annie's shy protests that she didn't need recognition. The foundation helped countless families and prevented many similar tragic situations from occurring. As Hope grew, she began to understand her unique story. Her parents never hid the circumstances of her arrival into their lives, instead celebrating the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them together. They taught her about Annie's courage and compassion, values that Hope came to embody herself. The hospital created a permanent display in their entrance hall, sharing the story of that summer evening when a young girl's quick thinking and open heart saved a life. The display became a reminder to all who passed through, patients, visitors, and staff alike, that compassion knows no boundaries. Annie's rescue story became part of the city's fabric, retold at community gatherings and shared with new residents. It served as a powerful reminder that heroes come in all ages and colors, and that the purest acts of kindness often come from seeing past surface differences to recognize our shared humanity. Years later, when Hope started school, she would proudly tell her classmates about her special big sister Annie and how they came to be family. The story, passed down to a new generation, continued to inspire and teach valuable lessons about love, courage, and looking beyond appearances. The medical staff who witnessed that remarkable night went on to share the story with new colleagues, using it as an example of how preconceptions can blind us to the simple truth of human compassion. The emergency room nurse who first attended to them retired years later, still citing that night as one of the most memorable moments of her career. Annie's grandmother, who had taught her granddaughter to see with her heart, lived to see the lasting impact of those lessons. She watched with joy as Annie and Hope grew closer over the years, their bond transcending the unusual circumstances of their first meeting. The community learned lasting lessons from Annie's actions. Local organizations continued their work, bringing people together across racial and cultural lines. The mural depicting Annie's rescue became a landmark, regularly updated to include new stories of community unity and courage. As the years passed, the story evolved from a dramatic rescue to a cherished part of the community's identity. It showed how one person's pure, unbiased compassion could ripple outward, touching countless lives and inspiring generations to come. In the end, Annie's simple decision to help someone in need had created a legacy of love, understanding, and hope that would last far beyond that summer evening.